Welcome, everyone. It's the final event of the Festival of Friendship 2020. We wanted to go out with a bang, and so who better to get than Greg Wolfe? Greg is the founder of Image Journal. He founded the MFA in Creative Writing program at Seattle Pacific University. He is the author of many works of his own, many books, including Intruding Upon Timelessness and The Operation of Grace, further essays on art, faith, and mystery. And as of late, he has been helping bring other authors to bookstores and bookshelves as the editor of Slant Books. Greg Wolfe, great to have you.
Glad to be here. Thanks, Joshua.
Our next guest, our next panelist, Theresa Kiser, will be talking, I think, more about the nuts and bolts of writing and getting published. But with you, given your career, I'd kind of like to talk a little bit more about writing itself and self-expression. And is self-expression just simply narcissism? Why does it just seem sort of endemic to the human condition that we have to express ourselves through painting or telling stories or writing books? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it is, yes, the classic way of describing the impulse one has to create arises in that way. I want to express what is inside me. And on a certain level, of course, that's true. But I think there's sort of a paradox involved in the whole way we approach this idea of self-expression. It's sort of similar to the gospel paradox of losing your life in order to save it rather than saving your life and then losing it. And what I say to my writing students is writing isn't fundamentally about self-expression. It is about doing justice to the world. That is, it's about your encounter with reality, the impact that reality makes upon you, and your attempt to literally do justice to that, to render it in a way that's intelligible, meaningful for others. And I think the paradox of creativity is, in the end, your individuality will emerge to a greater extent the more you are forgetful in a sense of yourself, the more you're becoming this seeing eye that's taking in, that's receiving, that's knowing, because your individuality is, trust me, it's going to come out. It is precisely the essence of yourself. But if you short circuit the process, here's another way of putting it. Writers who I respect have said something, and they all repeat more or less the same phrase. And when I first heard it, I was shocked. I thought, this is crazy. This doesn't correspond to my idea of what a writer does. For me, growing up, a writer is somebody who first who has an idea and then sits down and puts the idea on paper. It makes sense, right? It's a pretty straightforward way of looking at things. But here's what I kept hearing from these creative writers. And creative writing ultimately is what attracted me most, the writing that had imagination and cared for the beauty of form and all of that, not just pure utilitarian prose. So what they kept saying was more or less a different takes on, I didn't know what I thought until I wrote. I'm like, it doesn't make any sense at all. It seemed to almost romanticize the idea of artistic process. But I came to understand that it's not subjectivism, it's not romanticism. It is really about the way that our minds and imaginations work. The danger for the creative writer is that we start with an abstraction, that we end with an abstraction. The creative writer tends to start with the concrete and then end with the concrete. And again, philosophy and theology and politics, again, my argument would be they'll come in as part of who you are. But if you sit down with a thesis to write, anything other than the more particular utilitarian genres that require such things, you're going to end up creating propaganda. You're going to be, you know, the poet John Keats once said, "We hate that which has a palpable design upon us." And if our writing has a design upon you, I am communicating a message to make you do something. Unless you already agree with that, and of course, a lot of people today like to read just to agree with, to get their own prejudices reinforced. Then unless you really have given into that, you know, you want writing to be an act of discovery, you know, a surprise. And that, I think, is where that phrase, "I didn't know what I thought till I wrote," comes in. It's about caring about the material that we're working with, the characters, the reality that we encounter. It's about caring about the craft of what we do, and trusting that when we're sort of literally kind of forging this on the anvil, that the connections that we need to make will be made, and we'll discover the deeper truths that lie beneath the level of, oh, I have a message I want to convey. So that's where I think that phrase ultimately comes, and that's why I think writing is only self-expression tangentially, or, you know, indirectly. Don't start that way. Start by trying to look at what is in front of you, like a painter would, or an artist, and render it accurately, and you'll find your individuality, your style coming out.
Just a quick question. Sometimes you hear new writers are told, write what you know. I've also heard new writers to be told, don't write what you know, write what you love. Where do you fall on that? Or do you have an opinion on that?
Not as strong an opinion as what I just expressed.
Yeah.
I think it all depends on how you interpret write what you know. I think write what you know has more value when you're not restricting it to just, I know what it's like to live in the Pacific Northwest, or I know what it's like to be middle class. If write what you know means write your humanity, sure, that's of course a good advice. But can you write well that in a way that's based on a lot on research? Of course, you can research something you don't know and write well about it, because ultimately what you're going to find is your subject matter that you've learned along the way is going to merge with your humanity, your sense of what it is to be a human being, to live and breathe and experience the world as a human being. And that will illuminate the know, that will become what's familiar and um, and second nature to you.
You were talking about ideology, and writing an ideological novel would seem to be pretty simple because you start with what you know, you end with what you know. There's no real act of discovery, as you were saying. Why do you think there's such something unsettling about mystery and ambiguity? We like mysteries, like mystery novels, because the mystery is sort of you know, at the end there's a very tidy coming together of all the threads, and we know the answer, we know who done it. What is it that just unsettles us about ambiguity?
Well, a lot of this is semantics, but a lot of it is also cultural prejudice. So the way I would put it is, you know, we live in a time which is probably not unlike many times, where people want to act justly and care for themselves and each other and the world, and they have very strong opinions about how those things are not being done and what stands in the way. And I get that. One needs you know, to care about justice and truth and all of those things. But particularly in this American culture, I think we have a tendency towards a kind of puritanical moralism in the way that we approach cultural artifacts. We're so intent on telling people how to behave and doing the right thing and virtue and all of that, that we forget our humanity in the process. And we end up preaching, and frankly, most people don't want to be preached at. That's what Keats called that palpable design. Unless, again, you already agree. But what's the value of being preached at when the preaching is what you already believe? That doesn't shake you up. That doesn't challenge you. That doesn't unsettle your complacency in the way that we know a properly lived human life needs to be shaken up and challenged. But I say that, we live in such a moralistic, ideological age that, when it comes to literature, when it comes to reading, most people read for self-congratulation, basically. You're reading books that have tidy morals and, ironically, good guys and bad guys, but they're all ideological good guys and bad guys. Whereas that's not what literature is about. That's not what it was ever about. Literature is about exploring the darker sides of the things that we don't want to look at, we don't want to face. Our brokenness as individuals, our vulnerability, our fear, our anxiety, our envy, our cowardice. Literature is precisely a space that the imagination creates that allows us to face the things that we normally don't want to face, and it does so in a way that doesn't preach at us. It's more invitational. It's more dramatic. It's a drama. It's not a kind of fable or allegory. And I think we're addicted in this culture to fables and allegories of virtue, whereas what we really need is dramatic work that draws us in, that implicates us, that reminds us that we're all kind of there's no one but us chickens here, and all of us chickens are broken, needy individuals, and that's what great literature does. That's what from Homer onwards, or Gilgamesh for that matter, it shows us heroism, but it also shows us the dangers of heroic egotism and arrogance. It shows us, Virgil shows us Aeneas founding Rome, but he also, at the same process, shows us the danger of power madness and megalomania and unending warfare. So mystery and ambiguity is simply a way of saying, what great literature, what great art does is help us to confront that which we don't want to confront, and to find a way to address it and pick a humbler, more honest, more just way of living and behaving. And that comes through drama. It doesn't come through propaganda. And so I think right now we're just in danger of reducing everything to kind of stick figures and, pumping our fists that the good guys have won. And, we may laugh at who the good guys and bad guys were in the 1950s. We can look at old Westerns or Leave It to Beaver and be sneering and condescending about that. But don't we have our own versions of those things? And I think if we stop for a minute and look honestly at the reality is, yeah, we're in danger of that same kind of black and white stick figure. So what I care about is what literature has done perennially, and the need to defend what literature does in an age not only of ideology, but also of technological distraction, and all the different ways that our attention is challenged by all the quick fix, razzle dazzle of the media, of smartphones and tablets and TikTok and Snapchat and what have you.
You made reference to the 1950s. There was a time in the 40s, 50s, and 60s when Catholic writers were really at the forefront of fiction. Graham Greene, Walker Percy, Flannery O'Connor, and I know you've written about this in the past. But could you talk about the role of the Catholic writer today? Does the Catholic writer even have a role today? What can a Catholic writer bring to this cultural moment?
Well, the Catholic writer is a term that many Catholic writers have problems with, and I get that. But I accept that we can use it as a shorthand for certain other ways of progressing towards truth. So here's how I would put it. I would say that a lot of people look back with nostalgia on that generation of writers. And the thing is, I'm old enough to know that many of those writers were very controversial among Catholics in their own time. And nowadays, Graham Greene is a hero because The Power and the Glory and The End of the Affair, and these are deeply Catholic books with real muscular kind of awareness of supernatural faith and the church teaching being important. People forget, back in my day, when I was coming up, he was considered a commie. He was a guy who had a mistress who cheated on his wife and hung out with Fidel Castro. And so I'm always baffled by the kind of contemporary people who are like gung-ho on Orthodox Catholicism, lionizing Graham Greene and dissing contemporary writers because we're all liberal heretics now, forgetting that Graham Greene was not exactly like your classic National Catholic Register, subscribing individual. All due respect to NCR, which I love and read. So a lot of this has to do with our perspective and our prejudices. One of the things that I most regret, that I think is the most terrible loss, and here the fault lies on both sides of the equation, is back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, Catholic intellectuals were part of the mainstream of American cultural life. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, if you think about those writers like Flannery O'Connor, Walker Percy, Dorothy Day, Thomas Merton, all four of them were published by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux, which is one of America's leading, if not the leading, literary publisher, right? They were not squirreled away in a subculture. Now, of course, that raises many large questions we don't have time to discuss today, because obviously the secular world or the mainstream world has exhibited prejudices and a sort of dualistic mentality that separates things out. No doubt. But I think for me, what irks me more than a secular person being nervous about religion, what irks me more is a religious person who is so full of self-pity and alienation that they assume that the mainstream professional world will not be interested in what they have to say, and who deliberately choose to live in a subcultural ghetto, which I think is crazy. I mean, everything about being Catholic means being universal. That's what Catholic means being out in the world because of what our faith gives us the confidence to do, that we understand that we find grace through nature. And so we're out in the world. We're not squirreled away in the subcultural ghetto. That's what our Protestant brothers and sisters have done. And, bless them. But that sectarian mentality creates a world within a world, and that becomes claustrophobic. It becomes very safe because you never stray from the ghetto, because everything is going to be done. Nobody takes chances. Precisely, they don't engage in that kind of pursuit of mystery and ambiguity that literature and great art require. So I mean, I'm really quite sad that there's very little space in the larger public sphere for writers of faith. And I think we can blame all we want for the prejudice of secular elites, but we have to begin with the kind of, I don't know, a sort of reality check with ourselves. To what extent are we contributing to this by a kind of fortress mentality that we've erected around ourselves? And how willing are we to, and the fortress mentality is kind of convenient because it means that we can all gather together mostly because we belong to the same club. We're not gathered together based on the excellence of what we do, the mastery of the craft. That's why the cultural products of a subculture, a ghetto, are always second rate, because they don't have the bracing challenge of having to create world-class work. that can compete, literally, that can compete for human beings' attention and respect in the New Yorker, on in the bookshelves of Barnes and Noble. And I think that the Catholic writer today has to ask themselves two questions. One, am I undertaking the arduous disciplines of mastery of craft, and am I willing to be out in the world with everyone else? And two, who are my models who are working today? Rather than looking at the past, who are they? And am I missing them because I've kind of concluded ahead of time that everything is decadent now and nothing good can come out of this postmodern era? Am I missing writers and artists who are alive and well and dealing with the same reality that I'm dealing with in a way that can inspire and inform me? I think there's a lot of ignorance out there about who the contemporary Catholic writers actually are.
Well, I'm wondering now that you are the editor of Slant Books, you're actually actively searching for these writers that you're talking about. Now, for people who may not know that much about writing or the role of an editor, I think some people think the editor is just, oh, this is the person I send my manuscript to, and they buy it, and that's it. But that's not exactly it. What is your role as an editor? What are you looking for in the manuscripts that you publish?
Well, I'm frequently asked that question. What am I looking for? And I have a somewhat facetious response. I'd say to people, if I knew what I was looking for, you should shoot me, right? Because what does that mean? That means only my prejudice is being confirmed. That means me reading for self-congratulation. So what am I looking for as an editor? I'm looking to be surprised. I'm looking to be shaken out of my complacency. I'm looking for not anything new under the sun per se. I'm not looking for innovation's sake, but I'm looking for the ways that creative people try to make it new. And we make it new by finding new forms to say the perennial truths, if you see what I mean. At least in the West. In the East, there's a venerable tradition of a kind of static, eternal tradition. You can see that in the tradition of making icons. And there's something beautiful and mystical that I revere about that way of approaching the nature of creativity. But the truth is that I'm a Western man. I can't unzip my Western skin and pretend I'm something else. And in the West, we progress by changing. Or let's put it this way, we don't progress because, in a sense, there's no progress. There's just the eternal reality of human life. But we stay alive. We stay awake by not repeating ourselves. And I think you find this, in the artists that you most admire. I think most people, if they ask themselves, which artist, there are artists that you might say that we just love because they tickle us, or they're kind of our comfort food. They hit a note that we like to hear. But the artists that we most admire, the most respect, are the ones who don't just sit on their laurels and repeat the same style. They're basically pushing themselves at each opportunity to do something new and fresh. So that's what I look for. Is to what extent is the writer seeking to play with form in a way that breaks open the perennial truths about the human experience? And again, I don't want propaganda. I don't want, I'm open. I think stylistic variety is the spice of life. I don't think it's right to think that one style is the only true appropriate style. I have friends who are, for example, very high on formalism, like writing poetry in meter and rhyme schemes, villanelles, sonnets. I have huge respect for that tradition of writing, and I think it's the way that every poet should be trained, for example. Do I think that all free verse is decadent and bad? No. Or I wouldn't admire someone like T.S. Eliot, for example, who embodies a lot of the cultural values that the formalists say they believe in. So I think it's important to realize that style and form are changeable, that they're changeable for good reasons, because they're what enable us to get beyond the cliche. And cliche is the enemy number one of writing, right? Why? Well, because it shuts the brain down, right? It the shade gets drawn. Everything goes dark. If you are repeating the same thing over and over again, the mind just stops working. So the desire for a new form is not innovation for innovation's sake. I mean, okay, there are people out there who maybe are a little slap happy with that sort of thing, but fundamentally innovation in the West has been about finding a way to keep alive a truth, preserve it from being lost by being repeated too often. A little thought experiment I give to my students, who are tempted often to be actually more conservative than I am when it comes to things like this. I say, imagine the first, imagine the Romanesque Architects Guild getting together and meeting in the first Gothic cathedral. Now, the Romanesque architects, they have the rounded arch, right? Which is Roman, that's the name, Romanesque. But it means that the windows in Romanesque cathedral are very small, so their churches are dark. And they love that. They love their dark, smoky churches because that's about mystery. And that's their way of looking at things. So they walk into this Gothic church and they say these huge windows, and they're like, I'm blind. And they see these little tiny pointy arches, these little weak, dorky, pointy things. And they're like, what's with this? These whippersnappers doing these bright churches with these lame little arches. Well, the reason that's a joke, if it's a joke at all, and I'm probably the only one laughing here, the reason why it's a joke is, from our perspective, those of us who are like, love the tradition and the Middle Ages, right? Well, those are both medieval styles, right? So we're looking at them both, and we're not like, but imagine those Romanesque architects. They're like, oh, forget that new style. That's evil. That's the devil. So I think that's a little bit of an illustration of why styles change in order to keep us awake, alive, alert to truth.
You made just a passing reference to writers that you admire. Who are some of those writers, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's difficult without some constraints there to know where to start. Do we want to talk about Homer, Virgil, and Augustine and
No,
Dante?
I was thinking maybe more contemporary.
Well, I think there are writers out there who, this, again, just to keep it within some boundaries, let's talk about Catholic writers, for example. There are Catholic writers at the forefront of mainstream American culture, literary culture, political culture, who I think the vast majority of Catholics that I know I've never even heard of, not even aware that they're Catholic. So, for example, the editor of Harper's Magazine, Christopher Beha. Christopher Beha is, we're talking Harper's Magazine, right? Like, along with the Atlantic and New Yorker, it's like the trinity of serious American publications at the forefront of the public conversation about what is important to us as a people. He wrote a book a few years back called What Happened to Sophie Wilder, which is in some ways a throwback to Graham Greene. It's very similar to his The End of the Affair. It's about conversion, it's about sacrifice. In a sense, it is a return to Greene's territory. I found it amazing that hardly anyone I knew in the Catholic culture was even aware of Christopher Beha. I would say another one would be Phil Clay. Phil Clay published a book that won the National Book Award about stories about the military from his experience being in Afghanistan. And he's just come out with a new book called Missionaries. Now, you might not like his politics if you're in a certain spectrum, but he's a Catholic writer, Catholic educated, and this is a book that's being discussed everywhere right now. Older writers like Alice McDermott won the National Book Award for Charming Billy. She chronicles Catholic New York, basically, from the 30s to the present in her writing. Again, it's just shocking to me that there are writers of this stature that many people, fellow Catholics, have literally never even heard of. And I think that just points out this larger dysfunctionality, this ghetto mentality, this fortress mentality, this subcultural temptation that many Catholics have fallen into in a kind of weird imitation of Protestantism that I think is regrettable and we need to grow out of.
Gregory Wolfe, thank you so much. Now, how can people follow you and Slant?
It's pretty simple. There's slantbooks.com and there's gregorywolfe.com. So you don't need a PhD to find us on the web. We look forward to engaging with you and hopefully providing you good things to read.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So you want to write, you want to be published, maybe you already have a manuscript, and you're looking around at 2020 thinking, what do I do now? Hi, I'm Theresa Kiser. I'm a Catholic children's book author, the author of the board book, A Little Catholic's Book of Liturgical Colors for Babies and Toddlers, which shares the love of God through the meanings of the liturgical colors, as well as the Manakor Chronicles, a fantasy adventure series for preteens. So I'm here to share with you what is happening in the publishing world in 2020 from an author's standpoint and offer some tips on how to make the most of the unique challenges and opportunities of this year to get your words out into the world. How to be found in 2020 in the publishing world. So how can that work? What is going on? Even in a normal publishing year, getting published requires perfecting your manuscript, perfecting your query, sending out queries, query after query after query, receiving rejections, so many rejections, it's just part of the deal, and persevering until that acceptance finally comes. But this year poses some additional challenges. First off, the book manufacturers, the people who actually print the books and receive orders from the publishers, many of them are backlogged, and some of them are overseas. So getting their books printed and brought to the United States had new challenges in 2020, and furthermore, the timeline, like the schedule of books, was pushed back. And now what some of them are doing is even demanding more payment up front. So now publishing a book is going to be planned farther out than before, all the uncertainty, and also is potentially more of a financial risk, even on the production side for the publisher. On the marketing side, it's also a financial risk because of the uncertainty, because book launches usually involve an in-person event for sales, the book parties, the book launches, book readings, and those are not happening in person. Some of them are going online with mixed results. And so book launches and launch dates, some of them are being delayed or launched with less sales. It depends on the book. It depends on the strategy of the publisher, but all of that is changing. It's just different this year. Finally, editors and agents normally are backlogged with queries. The query is the sales pitch about your book that you send. So if you're a writer and you have a 60,000 word novel that you want to send to a publisher to be published potentially, you send a letter to the editor that tells them what it's about, why it would be a good fit for them, and that is your query letter. And it basically asks, do you want to read this book to learn more about it, to see if it could be a good fit for you on your side? And when you send that out, it goes into a huge pile, sometimes called a slush pile, and the editors read those as they have time available. What's happening this year is that as soon as shutdown kind of happened in March, a lot of people started sending out queries. They had more time at home, fewer social engagements, and so they focused on sending out these queries, which is a good thing. But what that means is that editors and agents are more slammed than usual. And some of them have shut their window of submission, so you can't submit anymore for a while, or they just might take longer to get back. And so this is something that happens where editors and agents will open and shut their submission windows, and that it does normally take a long time. So it just requires more patience than usual and understanding the situation all the way around. So these challenges on the publishing side affect authors, certainly, because it might mean longer lead times, less clear answers once you do get a contract of when something might be published. It just is uncertainty. So what can you actually do this year? Well, at the same time as there are more challenges, the writing community has really banded together to create a lot of great opportunities for authors at the same time. So authors make income sometimes through their books, through their royalties of books and advances, but also through school visits, in-person talks, conferences. Usually these things happen in person, and many of those have just been canceled. So that changes the income for a writer's standpoint. So if you find yourself in this situation, I encourage you to get creative. That's what you do best. You're a writer. So get creative and figure out how to work with your craft and make income without having some of these other options available. So one thing that you could try, and this would be my first tip, would be to start to freelance. If you haven't freelanced before, writing articles, if this is something that you're interested in, there are so many online magazines or print magazines that accept submissions from writers. And this is a great way to continue writing and continue getting kind of a faster turnaround time for publication than would happen with a book. So I encourage you to type in a topic that you're interested in writing about and say like the top magazines about that topic. And then you'll see which ones pay, which ones don't pay, which ones accept submissions from writers, which ones don't. And you'll kind of get the situation for your topic. So that's one thing I would recommend is freelancing and writing articles. The second thing I would recommend is taking advantage of online events. So many educational writing events have gone online and have gone free. So conferences with the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, for example, usually cost a pretty penny because you're going somewhere in your region, or you're going to New York or Los Angeles, and you are paying for your flight and your hotel, all the meals, and then the actual tuition for the conference itself. This year, they're hosting so many opportunities that are simply free for members. And if you're not a children's book writer and you're not interested in the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, I recommend that you check out your genre. There are associations for mystery writers, for science fiction writers, fantasy writers. There's a Catholic Writers Guild, and so many of these organizations have posted free information, free educational material, material for learning, free webinars. The webinars have been great this year and just totally free and available, especially if you have a membership to one of these organizations. So that's the second tip I would say is take advantage of the free webinars and educational opportunities that abound on the internet this year. It's really been fantastic. Thirdly is hone your craft. If you are not making headway getting published this year, make sure your manuscript is the best you can be. If you haven't written it yet, write it. Write a terrible first draft. The first draft can always be terrible. And then edit it. Revise it, rewrite it, throw stuff away, edit. Take the time to do that. If you have fewer social engagements, if you have a little bit extra time that you can devote to writing, or even if you don't, if you are, feeling the pressure of all these pressures and you don't have time to go hardcore, then take it easy and just remember that you like to write and use it as an outlet the way that it maybe once was. Use it as an outlet and don't put pressure on yourself. So that would be my third tip, is to actually spend time writing and editing if you have the inner energy to do so, and make your work the best it can be. If you need extra support in that, this would be my fourth tip, is to get extra support for your manuscript and for your craft. This could mean joining one of the organizations that I've mentioned already, joining online critique groups. I love my critique groups. They're so great. And when you find one, you'll be with a group of peers, maybe a handful of peers, and you swap chapters or you swap manuscripts and give each other feedback. And it is so valuable and so helpful, especially when you find an uplifting one where everybody's willing to tell it to each other straight, but also is kind. So I encourage you to join a critique group. You can also get coaching. I offer writing coaching and paid manuscript critiques on my website, as do many other authors. So you can take advantage of those offers and of course, groups, peers, get your beta readers, send your manuscript off to a reader who's the age or has the interest in the type of book that you're writing, and get their feedback. I love my beta reader feedback. It is so helpful and is also really fun because you get a play-by-play on what somebody is thinking when they read their book, which you don't get once it's published. It's just out there and people will read it and they'll either say they like it or they didn't. And maybe if you're lucky, they'll tell you their favorite part or their favorite character or what questions they thought when they were reading through. But most of the time, all of that is private in their own minds. And so beta reader feedback is very valuable for revising and is also fun. So that tip is get the support you need. Writing can often be a solitary journey, but making your manuscript where it needs to be is not. You will need support from other people. And then finally, when you are ready, send the queries. Just get the lines in the water. Don't let fear hold you back. So when you have your manuscript as perfect as you can make it, and you have your query as perfect as you can make it, and there's so many great resources out there on how to make each of these the best they can be. And of course, using the tips that I've already mentioned can help as well. Then you send out your queries. Depending on if you want to be traditionally published, this is what this talk has been talking about so far, then you can, then you send to either an agent or an editor, depending on what your market is for your book. And if you want to be indie published, then I would switch this tip to get started. If your manuscript is ready, get started. You want to start looking for hiring editors, hiring cover designers, so that you have a professional and good quality book. And there are also good resources of how to make a professional quality indie published book or self-published book and not a poorly done one, which there are certainly both out there. So I recommend that whether you are indie publishing or self-publishing, that you get started. You don't let your fear hold you back, and you take your book and try to get it out into the world. Because here's the thing, right now, we are in a crisis of hope. We have so many pressures that are on all of us. And it is a lot to handle. We are also more isolated than we've been before. And it is times like these that it is most important to remember and to focus on what's good, what's beautiful, what's true. And when your writing does that, when you show through a story or explain through nonfiction the truth that good conquers evil, good wins, it triumphs, love is so much stronger than hate and indifference, and that everything that we are going through right now, all the difficulties that we face, they matter and they're used for good. These are the truths that we need to stay human and alive in front of our circumstances. And this is the power of the written word, is that we can share that gift, that knowledge with each other, even when we're far away. That you can read a sentence or a story over and over again and remind yourself that we're not alone. We're not abandoned here. And life isn't going to crush us. That we have already been promised so much more than we can imagine, and that it will come to fruition, whether we're part of it or not, but we can be part of it. I can't explain the way that I want to explain verbally, which is why I write. And I also know that even if I wrote all the books that I would ever want to write, I can't even begin to share all the beauty that is around us. So this is why we rely on each other as storytellers, writers, and human beings to accompany each other on the way. And so if you want to write, if you want your writing to be found in 2020, I encourage you to not let anything hold you back. Pluck up your courage, take up your pen, and write.
And now we want to welcome Chris Riley. He is a professor of film at John Paul the Great Catholic University. Really interesting background. He worked for 14 years at Warner Brothers, and he started in the script department. He was a script reader, and then he wound up managing the script processing department. He left Warner Brothers to concentrate on writing feature films. He and his wife, Kathy, wrote After the Truth, a German film that is quite acclaimed. And now he teaches screenwriting and film at John Paul the Great Catholic University. Chris Riley, great to have you.
Joshua, it's really good to be with you.
The first question I want to ask, I have a personal, sort of grounded in something that happened to me. I wrote a script a few years ago, and I gave it to a couple of people to read just for some feedback. And one of the people had never read a script before. And I kind of did that intentionally because I just wanted to see if the story came through, if it was understandable. Okay. Well, the first comment I got from this person was, "This looks weird." And something I failed to mention in your opening bio, you are the author of a book called The Hollywood Standard, which is the complete and authoritative guide to script format and style. And so since you are the authority on script formatting, I was wondering if you could start people off by sort of explaining what a typical screenplay looks like and why it looks so weird.
Yes, they are odd-looking documents, and I ended up learning more about them than I meant to. But really, the way that a script is laid out on the page goes all the way back to the silent film era. And if you pulled a silent film script out of the archives at Warner Brothers, it would look very much like a modern-day screenplay. A scene takes place somewhere and sometime, and so for the purposes of the reader, but also the team that's going to shoot the scene, we start with what we call a slug line or a shot heading that is all capital letters, and it says something like EXT, stands for exterior. It just means the scene takes place outdoors. So exterior Capitol building day. So that tells us where we are and when we are. It's really useful for the production team when they're scheduling to know if it's a day or night scene, and of course the location. And then we drop down and write a paragraph describing what is happening. And that's all in present tense, active language. And then we have this narrow column down the center of the page that's the dialogue. So you get the character's name and then whatever words they say. And you may have two characters talking, and then we go back to these wider margins that include more description of what we're seeing, what's happening. And so you get pages with lots of white space on the page. And then that scene may end with a cut to or a dissolve to before we get a new shot heading for the new scene. And so it really represents the way a film unspools chronologically, scene by scene.
My understanding is that one of the reasons for the formatting that way is that one page of a script equals roughly 1 minute of screen time. Is that true?
Yeah, on average, that's the rule of thumb. It's going to vary quite a bit on an individual page basis. Dialogue generally unfolds much faster than a page a minute. Action more slowly, but on average, it's about a page a minute, and we still use that page a minute rule of thumb when we're scheduling how many days to spend shooting a movie, and that affects budget. So I've been called on the carpet by studio presidents who thought we were changing the margins and affecting their schedules and budgets. They really care about this.
That's fascinating. I heard you give one time just sort of an interesting, simple explanation to the question or answer to the question, what is a story?
Yes. So anyone who has been a student of mine will be able to immediately respond to that question, what is a story? They will say a story is a hero's struggle against an obstacle to reach a goal. And I borrow that formulation from a veteran television writer named Bill Idelson. But the concept is not original to him. It's just an observation that many people have made about how a story works. And it is always about someone we can relate to, hopefully, not always a nice person, but someone we can identify with who wants something badly, and they're running into obstacles against which they struggle. And for the most satisfying stories, what we hope is the character needs to grow and change in the process of that struggle. And it turns out that we as humans are really interested in watching people struggle, and we're interested in seeing characters transform.
Now, what was your job as a script reader? For people who don't know how film studios work, you didn't have the ability just to say, hey, we're going to make this movie because I like the script.
No, they didn't ask me that question. My department took in all the scripts that had been bought by the studio for film and television and were being developed through a long process of many rewrites, and then going through production. And we would put those scripts into industry standard format and print hundreds of copies that would go out to the executives, to the actors, to the production staff. Often there'd be a new draft every day, especially for TV series. And everyone was really anxious to get the scripts because they were shooting their movies. And so we were sort of an overnight lightning script publishing house for up to a dozen TV series at a time, plus all the features at Warner Brothers, as well as surrounding studios who brought their scripts to us. There are far fewer words, which as a writer, I really appreciate compared to a novel. I've written books and it's a lot of words. I love the forward narrative velocity of cinema. And so a screenplay is always moving toward the next thing. What happens next? a screenplay doesn't have the same ability that a novel has to gain direct access to the inner life of a character. The only way that I can communicate to a viewer what's happening is either by what a character does or what a character says. And so I have to find a way to illuminate that invisible inner life and inner transformation of a character by means of things that you can point a camera at and photograph. And I really love that kind of writing. That is my natural language. But that means it has particular requirements, and you've got to be creative in finding ways to show rather than tell, and keep the story moving forward so that every word counts. You can't have digressions where you spend 100 pages talking about, for example, Tom Bombadil in Lord of the Rings. That character falls away when you adapt Lord of the Rings to the screen because it doesn't actually advance the story. Works fine in a book, doesn't work in a movie.
You spent a few years as the director of the Act One program, which is a program there in California to help Christians, I guess, enter the film industry, the screenwriting and producing and directing and that sort of thing. What can Christians really bring to this moment? Like when you look out, we'll leave COVID aside for a minute. We'll get back to COVID in a minute. But just the film industry as a whole, what can Christians bring to the industry at this point?
I think that, number one, we have a commitment to meaning. And not everyone has a commitment to meaning, but stories by their nature create meaning. They create cause and effect relationships. This character makes this choice, and this is what happens in a relationship, in a kingdom that's at war. And so stories want to create meaning, and we crave that. Philosophically, someone who is committed to the idea that life is meaningful, I think has a valuable contribution to make. I really don't think in terms of culture warfare. I think much more in terms of making a contribution to culture. So I would hope that there would be more and more people who, under the influence of the Holy Spirit, being shaped and transformed by Jesus, would be telling stories that help people be more compassionate, that help people be more hopeful, that help comfort people who feel like they are the only one who suffers in whatever particular way they suffer. So I think there's a lot of contribution that we can make in helping people see through the eyes of someone else. All of those things, I think, are gospel things. You know, I think of Jesus standing up in the synagogue and reading from the passage in Isaiah, which gives us this kind of broad idea of the gospel being about bringing comfort, binding up the brokenhearted, setting the prisoner free, helping the blind to see. I think that stories, that films can really help all of us blind folks to see new things. That's the contribution that I think we can make through the content that we help shape. Beyond that, I think there's an awesome opportunity through our work relationships with our colleagues, because filmmaking is such a collaborative medium. So for people who are operating under the influence of Jesus to be on the set or in that story meeting with a concern for their colleagues, with an ear to listen to what their coworkers are going through, and a commitment to love, I don't think that can hurt any industry. And I crave that for my industry. And I know I can't do it myself, and that's why I became an educator. I want to recruit more people who are devoted to Jesus to, come work in this field with me.
What has been the impact, and sort of what is the state of the industry right now with film production? Has it shut down or slowed, or what sort of steps are they taking to continue to produce TV and film?
At the beginning of the pandemic, production just shut down. And then by midsummer, there were companies that were beginning to figure out ways to restart production. Some of those ways are pretty tough on the people who are involved. So, for example, there are TV series that are shooting. A lot of TV production has moved up to Canada, and so the way they're shooting is everybody flies into Vancouver, quarantines for 2 weeks, and then stays within that bubble for months while they shoot, which means they're isolated from their families. They're seeing their families on Zoom. Those are tough human conditions. Then there are a lot of people who are out of work still. And then there's been this diaspora from Hollywood as post-production people. Editors have really demonstrated that they can do their work from anywhere. And so many of them have moved to other places in the country because they've decided, if I can't go out and have meetings or work in person anyway, I might move my family either closer to home or to a place where I can afford a house. So we've seen this diaspora of Hollywood professionals scattering out across the country.
That leads me to a question about the number of streaming services that we have now, the demand for content. You know, when I was growing up, there was just, you know, you had a handful of studios and TV networks. And, you know, when I grew up, you had three major networks, then Fox came along in the late 80s. And then, of course, now you've got, you know, a near infinite number. And so I remember when I was younger and when I was in college the first time, that it just seemed like it would be such a difficult thing to break into Hollywood with writing a script or something, because the number of people who could approve a script was just so low. And so then you would think, wow, with all these streaming services, there's such a demand, it would be a much better time or an easier time. But is there kind of a double-edged sword in that with the multiplicity of venues, now it just becomes even harder to make yourself known?
It remains a really competitive business. Now, there are more television series in production than ever before. The Writers Guild tracks, you know, where the work is. And during my career, the majority of the jobs have shifted from the feature film side to the TV side. And now something like 2/3 of the screenwriting jobs for Writers Guild members are in television. Television is having a golden age right now. There are so many shows. Not all of them are great, but some of them are really astounding in how good they are. So that creates opportunities. But most streaming series have a season that consists of 10 episodes rather than the traditional 22 or 24 episodes. That makes it tougher for their writing staffs to make a living because there are fewer, you're on the staff, you get fewer episodes that you are responsible for, that you get paid for. So in many cases, writer income has actually gone down on a per writer basis. And it just still remains really, really competitive because there are far more people who want to do this work than there are jobs. So I think it's hard. It will always be hard, but it's also fantastic. You know, it's fantastic to sit in a theater and watch an audience watch a story that started in your head, and to have the emotional experience that you hoped they would have. For me, I am still compelled to do that, even though most things that any of us write don't make it to the screen. Even when a studio pays me to write a movie for them, they develop 10 times as many projects as they actually produce. So on any given project, I have a 1 in 10 chance that that movie will be produced and get in front of an audience. That's one of the emotional and kind of personal challenges of doing this work, is you got to find a reason to write those scripts that feels meaningful, even if it sort of just stops its development at the script stage and never makes it to the screen.
For someone who is starting out in screenwriting, obviously they need to get your book to help with the formatting. What are some scripts, because they need to read scripts, what are some scripts that you think are really, really fantastic scripts that they can learn from?
I'm a sucker for drama, so I like things that are really character driven. Jojo Rabbit is a recent favorite of mine. The Taika Waititi script. Room is a fantastic screenplay, not The Room, which is famous for being one of the worst movies ever made, but Room. Rabbit Hole, the Nicole Kidman film, really about two parents grieving the death of a child. I saw that movie and I had to race home and search the internet for that script and immediately read it. A lot of these are very spare scripts. They're not flowery, but they go straight to the heart of the character, to the human experience, and somehow evoke emotion. Shane Black, the writer of Lethal Weapon, is famous for his very bold and vivid style. He talks directly to the reader and is constantly breaking the fourth wall. So he can be, he writes violent, profane scripts, but he's got a vivid voice. And so that can be an education. I think you choose the genre that speaks to you. You know, look at your favorite films and kind of evaluate what genre they're in. And then you find the scripts that kind of represent the best of that genre. I would read recent scripts from the last 10 years, because the style of writing evolves over time. I read thousands and thousands and thousands of scripts during my years at Warner Brothers. I think it's one of the most important things I did in my own development as a writer. So I'm a huge proponent of reading screenplays. It's not enough to just watch a lot of movies. If you're going to write movies, you have to read movies. The good news today is you can find a lot of those scripts for free online. The best thing to do is Google the title of the movie and the abbreviation PDF. You don't want a transcript that a fan has created. You want the actual original script, and typically those are PDF files.
Before we go, I just want to ask, do you have a passion project that you would love to, a script that you've written, a project that you would that's your dream project that you would love to see come to fruition?
I do. There's something, and generally it's whatever I'm writing now, but I'm writing 3 things right now, one of which I've been writing for a really long time. My family went through, I won't call it a tragedy. We went through a pretty significant loss with one of our children. And I have for a long time wanted to figure out a way to tell that story. And it really is the story of husband and wife dealing with grief over the distance between the life they dreamed and the life they got, which I think is universal. I think it's true of all of us, that we're dealing with this gap, and how we deal with that either makes us bigger, more compassionate, more joyful people, or it makes us smaller, harder, more bitter people. So it's called Imagining Elliot, and I'm 20 plus drafts into it. And my wife and writing partner is the toughest critic I know, and I can't quite get it past her yet. So until I get her stamp of approval, the agent doesn't get to see it.
Okay, and one final question. The theme of the festival this year is You Will Be Found. And so I'm curious, how did film and screenwriting find you? I'm assuming you were young, but was it a film that you saw? Was it something you read? How did it find you?
I saw Ordinary People. So back in I suppose that's the late 70s, maybe the very early 80s. And it was a revelation to me that film could show me the secret lives of other characters. I was a fairly isolated kid. I wasn't quite sure how you connected with humans. I was really hungry to connect with humans, but it mystified me how you did that. And film really found me in the sense that it connected me with the human race. It showed me that other people struggle in ways very similar to the ways I struggle, that they feel pain. And number one, I realized, oh, I'm not alone. I'm not the only one. And number two, if other people are struggling like that, I got to treat them better. And then the third thing was, I thought, I want to do this. I want to create these experiences for people. And it really set me out on a decades-long quest to learn how to do that. And then I always have this impulse to pull other people along behind me. So what I learn, I try to pass on to other people and hopefully lift them up on my shoulders so they can reach higher.
Christopher Riley, thank you so much for joining us for this. It's been fantastic.
Yeah, thanks for a really fun conversation.